Hello, I'm David Webster. I'm a partner in the corporate and commercial team at Russell-Cooke, and I'm joined again by Mark Fletcher, a partner in our dispute resolution team. In an earlier video, we looked at some general issues relating to dispute resolution, and one of the themes we picked up then was our broad categorisation of the types of disputes which businesses face. This talk is going to look in a little bit more detail at the first of those categories, so internal disputes, which are disputes between people who are within the business, most commonly directors and shareholders. Now, in terms of what a dispute is, a certain level of disagreement and debate within a business is actually very healthy. A lot of businesses can get themselves into trouble if they don't have that level of active debate, and either a board is comprised entirely of yes people who will just go along with the views of one particular individual, or everyone else just assumes other people are dealing with certain aspects. That is, in fact, a common ground for disputes in and of itself. But of course, there does need to be a balance. And whilst a certain level of disagreement and debate is healthy, it can obviously cross a line, and that's where you get into the territory of legal disputes. Often, when there are disagreements at board or shareholder level, you'll end up in a situation where you've got a disappointed minority, and they are disagreeing with decisions that are taken and imposed on them by the majority. And this can create a factionalism which needs to be controlled and managed. And so, Mark, do you want to talk a little bit about the phases of those disputes and how they arise?
Yes, thanks, David. So where you have this factionalism develop, it normally goes along kind of three phases. The first phase is that you'll tend to have some form of trigger dispute, where there'll be some issue, event, decision, or action, which will usually be related to the business, but might involve things completely unrelated. And what that does is just start relationships between the parties to start to sour. Then, over time, that will worsen, and what you can then end up with is some form of procedural or management struggle about who should control the business, how decisions are made, and what kind of factors are taken into account in that decision making. So that would be people starting to feel not listened to, having their views disregarded. And then finally, eventually you'll reach a stage where things get to the point of a formal dispute that will either lead to the parties falling out and may ultimately lead to formal proceedings. Yeah. So in many cases, these kind of disputes go along the lines of a relationship breakdown. And so company disputes often have many similarities to actual divorces, because you've got people who have been working together in a relationship together, and when that starts to go wrong, lots of acrimony can ensue.
And so one of the things we wanted to do with these videos is help businesses think strategically about how to manage these disputes when they do arise. And so I think one of the first questions to look at in terms of that strategic consideration is how serious the problem is. So it's obviously very easy to spot really serious problems. If you've got a director who's basically emptied the company's bank account without authorization, then that will become apparent quite quickly. And also, unless there's a surprisingly good explanation for it, it'll be pretty clear who's in the wrong. But sometimes these scenarios can come out of the blue as well. For example, if a director or shareholder is having personal problems and that's impacting on their professional life without people really realising it. But generally, we tend to find that rather than being one sort of very specific nuclear event which causes massive issues, disputes are normally a reflection of issues which have built up over time, often with a relatively minor, perhaps trigger event, to use the terminology Mark mentioned earlier, but which isn't dealt with properly and which then escalates but isn't satisfactorily addressed.
Yeah, so whenever there is a disagreement, rather than immediately diving straight in to try and resolve the detail, there are some preliminary points that the managers of the business and both sides to the dispute should really carefully consider to decide on an effective approach. So the first one is the financial implications of any problem. Now, this is usually the easiest one to quantify. You can put a cold hard number on it. So that will be just immediately looking at whether there are any cash flow issues that are arising, but then also what is the amount that's really at risk. Then that leads into decisions about whether you can afford to ride the issue out, or if we're dealing with something that's potentially make or break for the business. The second important point is effort, and how much of each person's limited time budget do they want to spend for this matter to go on the company's agenda and to take away attention from other things the business needs to deal with. The issue with internal disputes is that they are dealing with an issue about just the company's management and not about how the company is dealing with third parties. And it's ultimately dealing with third parties that is going to be important for the business's success. So also you need to be thinking about how much effort not only the management needs, but from other parties, like how much legal input, how much finance input it's going to need, how much of the company's resources are going to be swallowed up by this dispute. And then finally, you need to have a look at the future prospects for the business and how this is going to be affected by the dispute. And when you're dealing with a company relationship or a business relationship, it's important to try and look at it from both the winner and loser side. So is this something that people are going to be able to come back from and agree a way forward? Or is this something where relations are going to sour and it's going to make things more awkward? Or instead, are we dealing with something, an issue or a situation where effectively it's pushing towards the end of the line for the company in its current form?
And I think one other sort of thing I'd like to say to supplement that is that some of those things you've just run through there may sound like quite sort of obvious statements in terms of things to consider, but I think having that strategic framework to evaluate disputes is really important, because there's often a very natural reaction that if you think you've been wronged or ripped off, you want to hit back immediately. And sometimes it will be appropriate to take aggressive action, but that generally tends to be the minority of occasions rather than the majority. And if you are going to do that, it's really important to do that on the basis of having made an informed decision about the risks and benefits of that type of approach.
I think also trying to adopt a more strategic approach helps you rationalise a feeling you probably already have. So where there is a board level disagreement, there's almost a necessary triage process that you go through to either decide the issue is a minor inconvenience, which is not ideal, but frankly isn't worth the time and effort to resolve. And there are lots and lots of those disputes for businesses. And hopefully over time, if the business goes from strength to strength, it will be forgotten. Alternatively, you're going to have potentially seriously damaging issues. So something that causes materially affects the operation of the business in the short to medium term, and it needs to be resolved properly. Or alternatively, there needs to be some kind of interim quick fix so that everyone can move on and try and work out how they're going to go from then on. So finally, the most serious example is where you've got something potentially ruinous for the company. So there's a risk that relationships can't be salvaged, and that maybe even the future of the business itself is at risk.
So I think working through that analysis we've just gone through there, that in many cases will resolve disputes before they arise, particularly the sort of easier ones, the ones which are minor inconveniences. They can often be dealt with by both parties just taking a bit of a deep breath and moving on. But if things do escalate and you are in more serious territory, Mark, do you want to talk a bit about how you evaluate your sort of angles and approach to a dispute?
Yes, so sometimes with all the effort in the world, parties can't avoid disputes, either because they're responding to a claim being brought by someone else, or because they feel that the other party's behaviour is so unreasonable that they've got no choice but to go ahead. So even in this stage, court action is not inevitable. Most of our cases do not end up in court, and they don't end up in trial. What you have is, as long as there are people getting the right advice and a willingness to act commercially, the disadvantages of going all the way through to trial will normally outweigh the benefits of an early settlement. Not only when you're factoring in the risk and costs involved with litigation, but also the management time involved. The reason it's not a good idea to go to court is that there is so much risk involved in the process. But if the tipping point has been reached and you can see that you're party to a dispute that's going to go ahead, all you need to start off is by looking at how you're going to make your decisions. So the starting point is whether you have enough information to start making decisions. How will you be able to document your position if the dispute escalates? Do you need help from third parties on any legal or technical points? Then you can start looking at the commercial options for settling a dispute. So in a business dispute, there's normally one option available, which will be for someone to buy out the other. So if that is something that can be considered at an early stage, it can have tactical advantages in the dispute itself. So questions of whether you can afford the buyout, whether the other parties can afford the buyout, and then also issues about what level of shareholder support you have. And then finally, you start looking at your legal options. So you'll be looking at whether parties have complied with their legal obligations, for example, under the shareholders agreement or directors' duties. If there's anything in the company's articles of association that are important. And then what kind of procedural options you might be able to pursue to try and help resolve the position.
I think one other sort of factor that is worth taking into account is not so much a legal factor, but it's really judging the sort of personality and approach of the people you're in opposition with. Because if the people you're in opposition with are operating commercially rationally, as Mark said, the majority of disputes don't go to court and it's possible to agree a settlement. But broadly speaking, there are a couple of categories of people who are very difficult to deal with. The first is what you might call rogues. So the people who aren't really interested in complying with their contractual obligations or the Companies Act. And the only way to really address those issues is by taking formal legal action. Or secondly, people who, for whatever reason, are very committed to a particular cause or course of action and actually see litigation as an end in itself rather than a means of resolving a dispute. And if you end up dealing with either of those type of people, unfortunately, a formal legal process is far more likely.
For the second category, there can be, in company and business disputes, quite a lot of scope for people to take principal points. That can also involve issues around the compliance of the Companies Act. So, though there are lots of technical requirements in the Companies Act which tend to be observed in the breach, but then in a business dispute, once that relationship sours and there's a factionalism has developed, then there can often be quite a lot of opportunities for people to start taking very technical points about the company's processes not being followed.
Yeah. And what you tend to find when those cases reach court is not that the courts will disregard the Companies Act altogether, but that if a company's got a history of being operated on a fairly informal basis, judges don't look too kindly on people then taking these very, very technical points which they've never brought up in the previous 10 years, as long as people are generally acting in good faith. And the type of phenomenon Mark's described can actually sort of lead people to taking their eye off the ball, I think, in terms of, disputes and focusing on minutiae which aren't really that important.
Where this assessment is all going to is making a decision. And so often, unfortunately, once you're in a dispute, it's not about choosing the best option, but the least worst one. So what you need to do when you have any kind of dispute arise is take an immediate response. So are there any damage limitation steps that need to be taken straight away? Is there a holding position that can be agreed? How can you set your position up for the future? Now that's really important because even on a case that is going to court, it will still take months or years for that dispute to be resolved. And the business cannot just stop during that period. So it is essential for the business, even where people are not cooperating anymore, to have some form of agreement, because it's ultimately not in anyone's interest for the business to fail whilst their dispute is being resolved. Then you have to look at the dispute itself. Is it something you can leave unresolved and hope the situation might improve? Do you settle it now on the terms available at an early stage? Or do you need to escalate the dispute or respond to the other side's escalation in order to try and achieve a resolution? And then finally, it's important to have your end goal in sight. Do you want to try and repair the relationship enough to move on? Do you want to try and do a separation through a demerger or some form of buyout process? Or will you need, in order to reach a resolution that you're comfortable with and that both sides will accept, to progress the dispute through some kind of third-party process, like unfair prejudice proceedings or derivative claims, in order to achieve your preferred outcome.
And I think where all that leads us is that, although we've covered quite a lot of detail in this talk, I think the real key theme that comes out of it is, if you do find yourself unfortunately involved in a dispute, taking a strategic approach to analysing what the causes of the dispute are, how they can be dealt with, and how to minimise the damage arising, and your course of action is always going to be the best approach. Sometimes that will lead to aggressive legal action. Sometimes it may be possible to resolve the dispute in and of itself.
If you have any questions arising out of this video, please contact the corporate or dispute teams at Russell-Cooke.